All right, a bit in a rush with everything, I would say, but sorry? Yeah, yeah. Not yet, I still need to finish this recording first. Like, just afterwards, I will start looking into it. How does it look, all those ethnographies?
We've taken off this video list. I include the city mix sugar.
All right.
So that's it.
Yeah. Let's see if everything works as it should. Hello, Clive. Can you hear us? Oh, sound is off here.
There we go. Can you see me?
Max, isn't there something with the speakers?
I can see you perfectly. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Now we can hear you. Hello. How are you doing?
Right. Yeah. I'm just trying to remember where share screen is. It's that little green button, isn't it?
Yeah, that should be the one. It's always good to test it beforehand because we had a couple of talks where we had these kind of technical difficulties.
Oh,
so.
Right. Is my volume okay? Speaking microphone. That's okay. Right. Let's just try this then. I'm going to go straight into this. Yes. So that's it. That's good. Yeah. Good. Okay. That should work. I hope. There we go. There we are. Sorry about the confusion over the invite.
Oh, no,
I often do it. I just hadn't. You were absolutely right. I hadn't read down the email.
That's completely all right. I haven't mentioned it in my email. You said that you were supposed to be in Caribbean, right, around this time of the year. Well,
yeah, normally I would be, but COVID has. We're hoping to go in January, but it's not looking good at the moment. But anyway,
what kind of project is that?
Well, it's my wife has an archaeological project out there. It's a huge prehistoric midden on this small island, and she's also been looking at the colonial history and excavations, and has got a couple of volumes. Well, one's published and one's in preparation, and she's also building an archaeological centre for them so that they can store the finds, which at the moment are not doing very well in the back of a disused container. But so we need to get out there to finish off that project and the building. We were desperate to see this building, but anyway, there we go.
How big is the team that is working there on this?
Well, at the moment, there isn't a team working on it now, but there were a lot of students over the years, and there's also a lot of other universities, particularly from the States, that are looking at particular aspects. So it's a hub for all of them as well. So it's the colonial archaeology is really interesting. And this was an island that's, about the geographical size of Southampton, and yet in 1805 it had the British Navy parked outside it because it was just so important for the British economy, and it's just this tiny little speck, and it's now its own independent nation of about 40,000 people. It's just great.
How is it called then?
Well, it's a federation. It's two islands. It's St. Kitts, which is short for St. Christopher, and then the island that we're on is Nevis.
Oh,
so named because Columbus sailed past it on his second voyage and thought he saw snow on the top of Mount Nevis. It was cloud.
No. Right. Is this the first archaeological excavation that is going on there? Or...
No, there's been a lot. Not many of them have been published, and that's what my wife is dealing with at the moment is getting them out into the public domain. But those small Caribbean islands have received a lot of work, particularly from Leiden, and from University of Miami. All those areas of all those places have been doing.
You said Leiden, like from
Leiden,
Netherlands.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They've been there are Dutch islands there, like Statia and Saba were Dutch. And of course, there's a lot of French interest. I mean, some of the islands like Guadeloupe are a département of France. If you're on the plane flying from Paris to Guadeloupe, it's treated as a domestic internal flight. So you can take your dogs into the cabin. It's quite.
That's convenient.
It's wonderful. Anyway, are you a PhD student, Jakub?
No. We are undergraduate students.
Oh, right. Oh, very good.
Yeah, this is.
So which year are you then?
Second year, and at the moment, yeah. So we are mostly society, run by undergraduate students, but then we have members who are basically from all different backgrounds. So some graduates, PhD students, some people who are like completely outside of the discipline, just interested in archaeological talks, who are not even in the UK. Like this kind of setting, this hybrid meeting that we can have like in person and also online really allows people from all around the world basically to join us if they are interested.
It's no, Zoom has many good things about it, and particularly at this time of year when you don't have to travel, it's quite, it comes into its own. Yeah, well, I'm pleased. I'm delighted you invited me because I've had a long-standing invitation from the Oxford Society, but for various reasons wasn't able to take it up. But no, this is good. I'm pleased to be there. Yeah,
we are very glad as well. You mentioned also that you recently became interested in the history of the subject. Can I ask about it? Like, well, are you working on some project that is like constant?
Well, I've written this book that OUP published earlier this year, which is all about the time revolution of 1859, when John Evans and Joseph Prestwich created this wonderful experiment in a gravel pit in northern France to demonstrate geologically that humans were extremely old, and that was great. I really did enjoy that. It allowed me to look into the 19th century and see what other forces were shaping archaeology, like the politics and the literature and whatever. So that was good fun. But yes, that's out now. It's called Making Deep History, because I've decided, even though I'm president of the Prehistoric Society, I've decided that prehistory is a term that has probably run its course, and that deep history is a better description of what we do.
All right, but isn't it, well, I don't know, at least I find it very interesting that you are like expert on deep history, right? And then you also undertook this kind of research on like quite recent history of archaeology. You are like taking it from both of the ends. It's like quite interesting.
No, it's well, it's the history of the subject in that particular, the history of the Paleolithic is it's had some work done on it, but I just thought that I've never found some of the accounts very satisfactory. So this was good to be able to expand. And of course, Oxford with the Ashmolean and the Evans archive is very well placed. And next year, there's the 150th anniversary of his great flint Bible, the ancient stone implements. So hopefully that's going to be celebrated, because it should be. It's not an easy work to read unless you're fascinated by flints, but it was a great, it's one of those door stoppers that really was a foundation for the subject. Yeah, no, he was quite something. So which part of archaeology, era of archaeology interests you in particular, or are you keeping your options open?
Well, I'm definitely interested in prehistory, or like, as you said, deep history. I still don't know yet whether, well, I would say it's mostly like upper Paleolithic, but
Right.
I'm not yet decided whether I want to focus more on like Europe or Africa in this sense, or also like in what kind of field, whether it's going to be more like, I don't know, stone lithic tools, or I don't know, like examination of bone and faunal remains. Yeah, that is still quite open for me, but definitely.
Well, there's certain, well, it's good to keep the options open at this stage. I don't know, have you seen this amazing paper that came out last week, which shows that horses trampling on flints or stones produced flakes which look very human?
No.
And the authors are using this to cast doubts over Gona and over Lomekli, you know, the two oldest sites.
Yeah.
So I'd be very interested to hear what Professor Barton thinks of this particular development.
Well, yeah, I'm going to attend some of his lectures next term, so I will definitely ask about it.
Ask him whether he thinks that there is an equine phase to flint knapping before hominins get the idea from horses or zebras, I suppose, and take it away. But it's published in Science, so it will no doubt go into the literature and be cited forevermore.
Yeah.
But so keep an eye out for that one. Horse nappers.
All right, that's a good shout then. I no, I haven't seen this one yet.
Yeah, I'll send you the link, but I'm not quite sure what to make of it.
Oh yeah, that's probably still up for discussion.
I think so.
Yeah. All right. It seems that we are getting quite a lot of people joining us. So, and it's about the time. So, I feel like we can start with a little introduction.
Okay.
So, welcome everyone. We are delighted to have with us today Professor Emeritus Clive Gamble, who is momentarily at the I think still teaching, right, at the University of Southampton.
Occasionally, yeah, occasionally. Not much. Occasionally.
All right, and he's expert on archaeology of human origins and timing of global colonization by earliest humans. And as you can say by the title of today's talk, it's going to be mostly, and we will hear mostly, about adaptive strategies of Neanderthals. I think so. So without any further ado, I'm leaving this virtual stage to you, Clive.
Thank you very much, Jakub. Now I'm going to do the share screen bit. Here we go. That's right. And there we go. Does that look all right to you?
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Okay, then. Right. Well, good evening, everyone. It's very nice great to be invited to talk to the Oxford Society. And I thought tonight I would look at a couple of case studies at Cotte and Lynford projects, which I've been involved with in the past few years, and to look at them in the broader context of what this tells us about our good friends, Neanderthals. Now, my starting points are two things, and I'm going to weave these into the talk and come back to them towards the end. And on the left there is a well-dressed Neanderthal. The paint, of course, is entirely fictitious, although we now know, of course, thanks to my colleague Alistair Pike, that Neanderthals were painting cave walls, so it's not entirely fanciful. But around his neck is this fine pendant, which was found in Portugal by João Zilhau. So that's something special, and I want to try and put that into some sort of context. And on the right are the excavations of Charles McBurney, who was professor at Cambridge, and he was my supervisor for a brief time. And this is at the site of La Cotte on Jersey, and this is something deep. And the two socio-ecological issues that I want to explore tonight are the ones of persistent places. These have already been touched on by Mary Steiner and Nick Rolland. And I want to ask whether Middle or Upper Pleistocene, is that when we first see them? And they are examples of cultural stasis and new levels of cooperation among these early humans. And the second sociological issue is one that I explored with Rob Foley, and this is about the male control of resources. When males started to control resources and through them the females. And this is, the question here is whether this is an Upper Pleistocene or a Holocene innovation, and whether this is an example of cultural change and cooperation. So there are a variety of aspects at work here in terms of when these happen, the time depth, and also what they might mean in terms of understanding Neanderthals. And Neanderthals stand at the center of both these two ecological issues. These are my two case studies. Cotte de St Brelade is down there on the island of Jersey, dated to something like 250,000 years ago, spanning marine isotope stages 7 to 6. And then up there in East Anglia, in Norfolk, is Lynford Quarry, which is Weichselian in age, 60,000 years old, and MIS 3. Now, I'll start with the persistent places, and a paper that I contributed to, but which was led by Andy Shaw, appeared in Antiquity 5 years ago, talking about persistent places, in which we pick up on an earlier paper by Schlanger, which is based in the southwest of the United States. And we define a persistent place as a locale that hominins repeatedly used beyond a humanly appreciable, by which we mean a generation timescale, and that it was a focus of activity over a geologically measurable time frame, and in this instance, throughout an interglacial or between glacial and interglacial cycles. So we're looking for that idea of persistence, about people coming back to a particular place time and time again, and also coming back even though the climate is moving from cold to warm, glacial to interglacial, because that tells us something. And this was something that Mary Steiner had picked up on, and Nick Rolland, when they started talking about supersites and when they first appear in the archaeological record. Now, here's La Cotte as this persistent place in the landscape, these massive granite headland, and here in the bottom right, it's at low tide, and there it is in relation to the island of Jersey. And on the right, you can see these pinnacles, these great rock pillars, and there in the dotted lines as McBurney's excavations that took place between 1961 and 1978 in the North Ravine, and where he found some remarkable archaeology. It's a huge site. It had been dug over many years by people before McBurney and was emptied, and not all of it was very well excavated. There's a small remnant left, and thanks to Jersey Heritage, who were investing a huge amount of money in the site to make it safe for visitors to get into. Excavations led by Matt Pope are currently taking place. They will not involve me, because to get there, you have to abseil down those granite pinnacles, which is something which at my stage of life, I'm going to leave to younger, more intrepid people. You'd be abseiling down this, for example, onto the last remaining intact deposits. So this is a view during the excavations, a wonderful image of health and safety in the 1970s. All these loose stones on the surface here, and the figure at the bottom, who I think is McBurney, but if it isn't McBurney, it's Paul Callow, who was largely responsible for recording and making sense of the site, particularly after McBurney died in 1979. Paul brought it to publication and did a tremendous job. But there they are in front of the long sequence, and you can see that the ladder propped up against them. And when they were excavating there, this is what La Cotte is perhaps most famous for, were these two large piles of bone, which survived surprisingly in a granite site where a bone does not preserve, but they've been covered in loess, which was rich in limestone. And so that actually preserved the bones, although they were very fragile. And you can see here, if you can see my pointer, this is a mammoth skull here, and those are the upper molars. There's another one over here, and all sorts of bones. And through this particular skull, there is a bone that's actually driven through the skull. And this large pile was beautifully described back in the publication in 1986 by Kate Scott. Sorry, I meant to go back there. And here is a drawing of it. It's very difficult now to reconstruct what it would have looked like as a domed feature. But clearly they were after a very dramatic pile of bones up here against the rock wall. And you can see other bones here. Here's a mammoth pelvis. There are also rhinos in here, and tusks, and all sorts of parts of the animals in that little narrow north ravine. The animals didn't fall in here. They were brought in here on purpose. This is what Andy and the other members of the team, Becky Scott and Matt Pope, have been able to reconstruct from the excavation archive. And here we have one of the bone piles up there in level 6, the big dark blue dots, and level 5 below it, and together they form one of these bone piles. So imagine the rock wall is to your left, and then away from it, as you move away from it, bone preservation falls off because the loess cover falls off, but you still find bones. And in amongst it is this rich quantity of flint work, the little black dots from layer 5. So it's a complex deposit over really quite a small area, and this is the site grid in centimeters here, and is really a very dense accumulation over this small area that was excavated very painstakingly over several seasons of bones and stones. There are no hearths or anything like that at La Cotte, 250,000 years ago, but there's plenty of burnt bone in the deposits, but no formal hearth features. Now, what we also found going back to the animal bones, and this was the work of Marianne Julien, and which Kate Scott hadn't reported on because it didn't, these things weren't dealt with in when they were looking at the bones back in the late 70s, early 80s, were cut marks. the cut marks are very clear on this mammoth tibia and on this rhino radius. Cut marks are not common on these megafaunal bones, but they're definitely there. And that's surprising because those of you who have been looking at Pleistocene animal bones, the general rule is that the larger the animal, the fewer or no cut marks will appear on those bones. These were expert butchers, and they were able to take the flesh off the bones without nicking them. As the animals get smaller, as you move into the reindeer and the red deer and then the roe deer, you end up with far more cut marks, just because it's to get the flesh off and so on. It's much easier to actually nick the bones with your stone tools. But cut marks are definitely there, which is another reason for saying that this is an intentional deposit, and these bones have moved in there rather than animals hurling themselves off cliffs like giant woolly lemmings with tusks. None of that. And of course, La Cotte was first of all interpreted as these mammoth drives, a bit like those famous bison jumps in North America with those fabulous names like Head Smashed Insight and so on. And here they would be going over the cliff at La Cotte, pursued by Neanderthals waving suitable things like fur coats and so on, and the mammoths would stampede over in that direction. Well, in an early paper, Becky Scott and Matt Pope showed that this was an unlikely scenario for killing these animals. And it now seems much more likely that the animals were killed in front of the site rather than driven over the cliff on top of the site. And they were driven into these little granite box canyons, which are exposed at low sea level today, and which, of course, when La Cotte was occupied, would have been dry land as the coastal plain stretched out in front of the rock headland, stretched out well into the Normanno-British Gulf. So I think we can forget about mammoth driving as the way that these animals were killed, but killed they certainly were, and then selected parts were dragged up. And here are the two bone layers, the heaps, 6 and 3, the upper and lower, and mammoth dominates, and it's adults with very few young or old. And the woolly rhinos, it tends to be young individuals, and this information comes from Kate Scott's very famous analysis back in 1986. So there's differentiation there. They are selecting parts. And the Cotte emerges then as a persistent place in the landscape. There's at least 200,000 years of repeated use and occupation. The bone heaps are down here in the Salian deposits about 250,000 years ago, but there are rich deposits in the Upper Pleistocene, which the team are excavating at the moment, and from which some Neanderthal teeth have been recovered in much earlier excavations. And we now have a good thermoluminescence chronology for these levels. But down here as well, there's a large number of stone tools. More than 200,000 came out of these areas, and over 10,000 faunal remains. That's fauna of all sizes, ranging from lemmings to mammoths. And here in the Salian bone heaps, there's one bone heap, the upper bone heap here, levels 5 and 6, and down here, the second one, level 3's bone heap, and then the layers carry on down here into much earlier deposits below this thermoluminescence date of round about 250,000, which pins the whole sequence into this chronology. When we were doing the project, refitting was one of the aims, and here is level layer 5, which goes along with the upper bone heap, all laid out in one of the labs at Southampton, and Andy scratching his chin there, wondering how it all fits together. And there were over 3,000 artifacts greater than 2 centimeters, very high densities. The environment was cool, and that's the date. And then down below the lower bone heap, again, huge numbers of artifacts, very high densities indeed per cubic meter, temperate conditions back in 7. This fits our criteria for a persistent place. The climate is changing, but the people are coming back. The only times they leave La Cotte is when Jersey becomes a complete island, and then the island is too small to maintain a Neanderthal population there. But as soon as Jersey is linked again to the mainland of France, and that rich coastal plain opens up, people are in there. It's as though that huge headland with its granite pillars is kind of beckoning people back, time after time after time. Repeated occupations over of changing climatic landscape. So there it is, and we know that they're using these larger landscapes because of where the stone sources come from, and the refitting program showed this very nicely with, for example, feldspathic sandstones were coming very locally to La Cotte, and they could be fitted together, very sort of expedient tools. And then the large pointed tools, often with brakes, which could be refitted in the site. These were coming from within about 20 kilometers away. And what they were doing was finding beach flint, because of course Jersey is a granite island. They were finding beach flint that was outcropping at other places on that coastal plain between Jersey and Guernsey up there in the left. So this is a little diagram of that. And here's La Cotte, the red dot down here. Here is the wonderfully varied geology in the Normanno-British Gulf. There's Guernsey at the top there. And here are the secondary context flints that dredging has produced. So there was raw material out here on these plains. Here's the feldspathic sandstone that is really quite close to La Cotte in this sort of area. And then down here, it's granites with quartz veins. So the quartz tools are, you just literally walk out of La Cotte and start picking up lumps of quartz. And these changed their lithic procurement strategies. Paul Callow had pointed this out, but what we've been able to add is the refitting evidence that Paul was never able to do, and also to show more precisely, because back in 1986, the marine isotope stages were still a very novel thing. We were able to show how the changing bathymetry of this area will reveal sources of flint at various times and how this is reflected in the site. And what the Neanderthals were doing through this is not just adjusting to climate change and habitat change with the rising and falling sea levels, but they're also adjusting their technological strategies. They are not pursuing a single technological strategy. They are pursuing multiple strategies, which are based upon solving problems of time and distance and availability of resources within that landscape and where people are coming from in that landscape and moving into La Cotte. So that really does start to fit that bill of persistent places. Here's just a little summary diagram of 3 of those levels, going from the glacial MIS6, which is a tough old glacial, And then the interglacial MIS7, which is highly varied, and we're probably towards the end of it. And here are the local flints and the non-local flints, the method of maintaining a transported toolkit through retouch, through resharpening these tranché flakes, and the use of flakes as cores. They are very adaptable in their strategies. It's maintaining things rather than leading to cultural change. They are, of course, very well versed in how in what the landscape will afford and what the landscape can produce for them. So these are highly intelligent, highly knowledgeable hominins who are using Le Cotte as a persistent place, coming back to it, recognizing it as home. And part of that home aspect is building those piles of bones in there. I'll come back to those bones towards the end briefly, because I've rather changed my view of it. I'm not saying that this is the general view of our team, but I've changed my view on what they might signify. So I'll come back to that at the end. So persistent places, these super sites like Le Cotte, lots of artifacts, high densities, repeated occupation. They can cope with many things that are thrown at them in terms of climate, changing the availability of raw materials, changing the availability of particular prey species, and they just ride through this, which is what makes, of course, Neanderthals highly adapted and highly successful hominins. Now on to the male control of resources, this other aspect. And both persistence and the male control of resources deal with these issues of cooperation, of how you get the groups. But it's not cooperation in the sense of everyone standing there, as in the old days, waving their hankies to drive mammoths over the cliffs at Le Cotte. It's more cooperation between the sexes, between males and females. And in the paper that Rob and I wrote, we drew up this cascade diagram, which was something that Rob had been working on in particular. And it goes here, it's the classic socio-ecological cascade model. And it's based on the asymmetry of reproductive costs for males and females. In other words, it costs females far more to produce children than it does males. And that biological fact underpins this particular line of reasoning, that the distribution of resources controls the distribution of females in the landscape and their reproductive potential. And it then, only then, does it determine the distribution of where the males are in the landscape in terms of access to females. So resources, the females want to be near the best resources because that lowers their costs of reproduction, producing children, rearing them, making sure they survive, healthy, and so on, which is good for the group. And they will involve the males in that at a later stage. But of course, at some point in human evolution, that classic cascade has been broken, and males have come to control the distribution of resources and hence where the females are. And the males have come to control female reproductive potential. And the question that has interested me since we discussed this is, when does this occur, and do we have archaeological information for it? So this is the basis for it. It's a lot of it's based on very early work by Richard Wrangham, which is on the ecological conditions favoring female bonded primate groups. And here's some female macaques, I think, looking very cute. And there's a chimpanzee getting her hands on key resources. And it's all about the success in cooperation. Cooperation, first of all, between females, and then between females or female groups and male groups. And here, of course, are the lionesses showing what you can do when you cooperate successfully. You don't need a man in sight here to put the ball in the net and get through to the finals. So they are a model for us all. And it's this part of Wrangham's diagram here, and these are his original figures. It's this growth diet where you get large, high quality patches, and the benefit is then to come together to exploit those. And so the females come together and form around each clump of really good high quality foods. These can be vegetable foods, they can be meat resources and whatever. And it's only later that they bring the males in. The other type of resource is a subsistence diet in Wrangham's turn, and these are more continuous resources, and here there really isn't the same basis for grouping. You're going to be non-territorial, you're going to be far more fission and fusion in those instances. And this brings me to Lynford, our Neanderthal site, 60,000 years old in Norfolk. Once again, fabulous mammoth tusks. And there's the excavator, Bill Boismeyer, old friend of mine. And this is the volume that English Heritage published, which looks at Neanderthals among the mammoths. And this was the Lynford Quarry that was dug with aggregates money. And it produced this great plan of material of mammoth bones and stone tools, all in a small oxbow cutoff, oxbow lake in an old river system. And here you can see the size of the tusks. Here's an upturned jaw and so on in these rich organic deposits which have led to the preservation. Many environmental proxies in this site, pollen, beetles, you name it, it's there in Lynford. The conditions all come down to interstadial, cold, open conditions, good OSL dating between 57 and 65,000 years ago. The start of that cold phase in, the MIS3, which is coming out of the very cold phase of MIS4, which is when you don't really want to be in Norfolk, a bit like being in Glasgow at the moment. And MIS3 starts to see a slight amelioration, and almost immediately that there's an amelioration, people, Neanderthals, are back here in Norfolk exploiting these rich growth food resources, or at least that's what I'm going to say. Here's the fauna analysed by Daniel Shreve at Royal Holloway. 11 mammoths, does that figure sound familiar to Lacotte? Adult males, again, very familiar to Lacotte. Reindeer, horse, bison are also there, but small amounts. No cut marks. There was bone breakage and there was the selective removal of parts. And as far as we can tell, absolutely no storage. They disadvantaged the prey using the boggy conditions around Lynford and then got out of that site fairly quickly. So here's a little comparison between Lynford and the bone heaps at Lacotte. There's the area excavated. Lynford, as you can see, it's an open site, so it's a huge area compared to Lacotte. There are the herbivore species. Lynford has a few carnivores, but not many. And the season of use is probably more than one. And when it comes to bone counts, mammoth, both sites, dominates. But look at this. Although carnivores are present, there's absolutely no carnivore gnawing. A paper has appeared about Lacotte in which carnivore gnawing is claimed. It appeared about 4 years ago, but we just can't see what the author was actually looking at to determine gnawing. It's just not there on the Cotte bones. There is a certain amount of cut marks, but at Lynford, they're very rare, even in comparison to Cotte. The limb bones are rare at Lynford, and Danielle has argued that that's because they were taking the limb bones away because they had the food value on them and leaving behind useless things like tusks. At Cotte, tusks were rare in that level, but common in that one. So the argument we make in the Lynford volume is the case for mammoth as a growth food, of being a mammoth as one of these incredibly rich packages which would serve to bring females together to cooperate. And the great thing about Lynford in having multi-proxy evidence is that we've got temperature estimates. Russell Coop produced temperature estimates from the beetles that winter went down to -15 and summer went up to 14 degrees centigrade. And Francis Green for the pollen estimated very similar figures, -8 and again summer 14 degrees. Very good correspondence. So being a fan of effective temperature, which of course is a measure used by Lou Binford, I thought it would be interesting to plot out using effective temperature, which basically is a measure of the growing season, which is controlled by temperature during the summer, the number of days that you're going to get when things can grow, when plants can grow. Doesn't really matter how cold it gets in winter, although you've got to be able to get through that. And you normally storage is the way you do that. It's more a question of the amount of growth that can take place during the summer. Now, this is Binford's diagram. This is effective temperature ranging from 8 to 13, very cold to medium temperatures. I've only included part of his diagram. And what you can see here is that hunting increases as you move here. There's also a few outliers in that area. Fishing is the key thing. Fishing, of course, does also include marine hunting, so it's a bit of a misnomer, seals and walrus and things like that. And gathering, of course, takes off with these yellow triangles as temperatures go up, as effective temperatures, growing season temperatures go up. Now, if we put Binford's famous Nunamiut in here, they have an ET of 9.87. They also depend, 90% of their diet is reindeer, and about 10% is fishing. There's no plant foods for them to use up there in North Alaska. So that positions them. When we look at Lynford and run those beetles and pollens through the same simple formula, we find that the beetles give us an effective temperature of 10.8 and pollen of 11, so about 11, so higher than Nunamiut. So this is contrasting Alaska with in an interglacial with Norfolk in a glacial period. And if we put them on the graph, they would fit along here for comparisons. But we, of course, know that they had no food storage and they had no fishing. There are no fish bones in that Oxbow Lake. So if they're a growth food, they're very dependent on mammoth up at this end of the spectrum, up in this area. So if you like, they're the Nunamiut, but without food storage and without the supplement of fishing to go with it. Here are the lithics, these lovely Boucoupé hand axes. The raw material was extremely local. There were 6 broken hand axes, and Mark White describes the whole strategy of procurement of this lovely flint, its knapping and its deposition as anticipation of where to go in the landscape, but not prediction. So they're looking for these animals, and they're looking for them to be disadvantaged within the landscape so that they can kill them easily. And our reconstruction would be then that groups are coming into Lynford and other sites in that area, and there are probably many Lynfords to find in that area as cooperation takes over and Neanderthals came together, and particularly Neanderthal females came together as fusion for growth foods. And then at other times of the year, they would fission out of that area to look for subsistence food, smaller pockets of food, single animals, and so on in that landscape. And the little dots here show the other buku-pei hand axes in the Lynford area, which just gives some idea of the scale within about 50 kilometers, isn't it, in that area. So that's just to try and give it some idea. So within that landscape, they were shepherding, and this is Mark and Danielle's interpretation, in order to disadvantage, anticipation, not prediction. And here they've anticipated and predicted very nicely where the animals are to be found, as well as the midges. It must have been a biting environment 60,000 years ago. So I would argue that here's a good example of growth diet with seasonal concentrations of large mammals easily hunted in that area because of the advantages of the terrain for shepherding them to their disadvantage. The females are drawn into those resources because these are growth foods and they're cooperating, and they then bring the males in to cooperate with the females to obtain and secure those growth foods, because this is something that males can do to the female advantage. And then in subsistence diets, the groups fission into smaller groups and out into the wider landscape. So it seems to me that the cascade is probably still following to a very large extent what Wrangham is saying holds for all primates. This distribution of resources determines where the females are, then determines where the males are, and that it fits in that way. So then we have to ask when and how male control evolved. Hominins and humans, Neanderthals and humans. And it seems to me there are two strategies for accumulation here. The one that most people would follow would take us into the Neolithic, when you've got stored food resources, when you have fields of wheat and barley and you store them at harvest time to get you through the winter and into the spring and into the summer when you get another crop. And once you've done that, it's very easy for the males to actually control those resources and start a village economy. And around that village economy, they can, the females have to come in, and the males control the key to the granary. And therefore they have control over the females and over the reproductive potential of those females. And that would be, you know, the consequence of agriculture, of settled agriculture, the necessity of stored foods, granaries, control of the distribution of those resources. But I think there's another way that you could look at this, and that would be to invest in aesthetic materials and artifacts whose significance is linked to ceremonies and rituals of social reproduction where they are used. And this gives you a different route, which is control through a treasury model, that people are linked through exchange, through knowledge of how the world works and what needs to be done to make sure the mammoths return, to make sure that the trustees stay out, if you like, the stewards of the environment. And you can see a situation there where it's quite easy for the males to control those resources. And here in this little timeline, and in particular look at ochre and shell beads, and this is mostly on an African time scale. And of course, Nick Barton's wonderful discovery of those shell beads in North Africa would fit in very nicely here. And of course, they're also found down in Blombos in southern Africa, over the whole continent, over north to South Africa. Those shame Nasurius shell beads start to appear, and ochre, again with Blombos and its engraved ochre, and going back in time. We've now got a lot of information coming out of these behaviors that are symbolic, that involve a kind of treasury model of these items of display, decoration, whatever, which link people over large distances and over shared symbols and shared ways of doing things. And this little pendant round the neck of the Neanderthal would be an example of this. But let's just quickly check on how Lynford, with all those mammoths, compares with an Upper Paleolithic site. So this is Middle Paleolithic versus Upper Paleolithic. This is from the Czech Republic. Those are the dates, 60,000 as opposed to 25,000. Here are the faunal lists, fairly similar. The number of mammoths is huge. Milovice has huge numbers of mammoths. Again, very little carnivore gnawing, very little cut marks on those bones, but a reversal. Limb bones are rare, and limb bones are common at Milovice in the Upper Paleolithic. They're common at Lynford, but rare at Milovice with the tusks. The argument here is that Milovice isn't so interested in eating mammoths. It's much more interested in going after the ivory. It's more interested in a source for making those little Upper Paleolithic ornaments and for distributing them around Ice Age Europe prior to the glacial maximum. And who would be controlling that? It would be the males. There is then a slight indication that this is happening earlier, as in Cueva Anton, and of course, Clive Finlayson's work at Gibraltar with all those instances of the use of bird feathers by Neanderthals to make cloaks and all sorts of things, and eagle talon claw necklaces. All this is starting to show that Neanderthals are moving in that direction. But the evidence from a site like Lynford is showing that there is still some way to go. So to conclude then, I think the two socio-ecological issues, persistent places, the evolution of supersites in the landscape, which is a very human trait, is basically a Middle Pleistocene innovation. And if you want to read more about that, Matt Pope has edited this excellent volume, Crossing the Human Threshold, which came out of one of the Jersey workshop. It's available in Routledge, but I'm sure the Bodleian has a copy. There's lots of papers in there from around the world which look at the inception of these supersites as a Middle Pleistocene creation, as an innovation during that Middle Pleistocene period. And then the male control of resources, the other side of cooperation, which is fundamental to how social organization is going to work eventually, post in the Neolithic and throughout the rest of deep history, is basically an Upper Pleistocene innovation. At the moment, I would still place it as really coming into strength in the Upper Paleolithic part of the Upper Pleistocene, as with the Paviland burial here, with all these intricate artworks and jewelry and whatever. But Cueva Anton, and now the increasing number of instances where we can see that Neanderthals were involved in such behavior, gives us pause for thought, until we remember, of course, that the Neanderthals are also an Upper Pleistocene hominin, so that we may be seeing some of that going back in time. What I think probably the key element is as well, is that we have this treasury model running alongside a model of when food storage comes in. And I've been investigating this with Alex Pryor at Exeter University, and we're pretty sure that we can demonstrate that this takes place during the Upper Paleolithic. We can't see it in the Middle Paleolithic, that people are storing food. They're becoming more Nunamiut-like, if you like, and solving the winter dearth problem by food storage. And of course, once you've got food storage in a hunter-gatherer situation, then you've also got the possibility of male control of resources. So those two strands are coming together in a very strong form at that particular time. But it all goes to show that everything happens before the Neolithic, and that once you get to the Neolithic, it's just putting up funny stone monuments, living in towns, abandoning your birthright of mobility as a hunter-gatherer, and leading to all sorts of problems that we're now trying to deal with at COP26. So thank you very much indeed. Here is our team, and for the Le Coq project, and here was the team for the Lynford project. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clive, for this talk full of new data about like Cotte and Lynford. It was really quite heavy on new information and data. So just saying for our audience, if anyone would have any question, just raise your hand or put it down in the chat, and you will be given opportunity to ask it, or I will read it out loud. But to give people some more time, I will start with the question myself. So now, towards the end of the talk, you presented this treasury model. And you argued for the special position of men within that society, and then you compared it with the side of Milovice and the Middle Paleolithic, and we know that there is this predominance of Venuses within art depiction. So how would you argue for this treasury position of man if we have in art depictions these Venuses, which are women in the center of all the kind of attention and the
yes, no, that's a very good question. I suppose it's who's making those figurines of women, and who is distributing them, and how and in what context they're being seen. To a large extent, we don't know the precise answers to those, but we do know that there is a very widespread geographical tradition of these figurines, roughly at the same time scale in the before the late glacial, last glacial maximum. But I think the way to look at them is to see them as symbolic of the need for linkage across groups at a very large pan-European scale. We also see it in the distribution of raw materials, and we particularly see it after the last glacial maximum, when things like jet and shells and amber are moving very considerable distances. They set up these large exchange networks, which is a very good insurance policy during harsh climates like this, so that if the reindeer fail to turn up in your area, you move to your friends and relations with whom you have established a relationship somewhere else in that landscape. And you've done that through the exchange of these common items about which you know a great deal. So I think it's operating at that sort of level. And I would see those networks as just so open to exploitation by males, because the males are probably going to be roaming over larger distances, whereas the females, particularly because they're tethered by the children to particular areas for protection, for the place where those resources are, the males have that opportunity to roam more widely and therefore make those associations and contacts. So I think it's in that sort of way. Why they decide to depict females in that particular way, I've never had a good answer to that question.
Right. Maybe kind of a follow-up question on this. Is there any, or are there any like ethnographic examples of societies where this model of like treasury position for men is set, to which we can kind of like?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think the way to go would be look at Australia. Australia is the continent of mobile peoples, of hunters and gatherers, and there you have very little food storage in Australia, partly because of climate, but you have a lot of growth foods at particular times of the year which bring people in. But you also have these continent-wide networks of exchange, whether it's grindstones, whether it's axe heads. There's even the narcotic pitchery, which is smoked, which was much sought after, and which a former Oxford colleague, Andrew Sherratt, once suggested was actually the route to agriculture was not through waiting for maize to grow larger and wheat and barley to become productive, but the best thing to do is to domesticate a narcotic plant, because you've got a very good return for your labor very quickly. And pitchery was grown in particular gardens in central Australia by males, and then sent through these exchange networks, Bruce Chatwin's songlines basically, and picked up all across Australia. It was the males that had knowledge of the environment, and the males saw themselves as stewards of that environment, and females were excluded from male activities, and they still are. There are still many objects that cannot go on public display and cannot be published in books, because if females see them, it is very dangerous and is not allowed. So one has to be very respectful of those traditions. Now, females have their own networks and of ritual knowledge and understanding from which males are excluded, but they don't have these very large intercontinental networks. So I think Australia would provide a very good example of how the males are controlling regional and inter-regional networks through accumulating these sorts of materials.
Okay, thank you. Then the site of Lynford, you at one point compared it to Nunamiut, basically, and
Yes.
what Lynford did there. So why would you say that among them there is not this kind of position of men as a treasury?
Well, the Nunamiut are interesting. I mean, the Nunamiut are very extreme. It was typical of Lou Binford that he would go to one of the most extreme groups that of hunters and gatherers, because, you know, they live in Anaktuvuk village, and the plane comes in bearing gifts like tin food and whatever, which is one of the reasons that they're in Anaktuvuk village, but they still do a large amount of hunting, which is very much a male activity. And what the males do is at those hunting sites, they will set up stores. And then when the landscape is under snow, they can get in, they can head out from Anaktuvuk village, either in dog sleds or on skidoos, and they can visit around the landscape their stores which they set up at another time of year, and they then bring that food back to the village where the women and the children are, so that they are feeding, provisioning their households within that village. So it's very much controlled by men who have prime access to those resources. I mean, the women are involved in the process when there's a labor demand, when there's lots of reindeer to process, when they're coming through Anaktuvuk village as they do on their migrations, and there they are at Binford's famous mask site, shooting them and so on. The women will come out and help process, but it's almost a reverse thing to Lynford, where I see it as though the women are in there and then they call in the men to help them deal with that particular labor needs. At the Nunamiut, it's the other way around, that it's the men who do the hunting and procure the resources, and the women who then come in and help for a period of time to set up the stores at Anaktuvuk. But the stores out in the country are almost invariably male. And if you look at Nunamiut, the book, it's a book all about storage. It's that's the key. That's the key thing that makes the whole system work, is the deferring of food from one time to another. And that's very similar to the treasury model, where you're deferring a payment at one time. You give someone a bead necklace and you expect it to come back at another time because you're hungry, and so you call on your friends and relations and say, feed me. Because you gave them a necklace at one time, you've set up a kind of, in the bank, you've made that payment, which is going to come back to you in terms of food at another. And hunter-gatherer systems are full of these examples of people operating over large territories in this way to spread the risk. And risk is paramount in hunter-gatherer society. Animals may fail, maybe a bad year and whatever, and you need to be able to spread that load. And even then, hunter-gatherer groups do starve and become locally extinct.
Right. Thank you very much for this answer, Clive. I'm sorry, but it seems that we will have to wrap it up and finish, because there is some other group of people that would like to use the room that we are having this meeting in. But it was really lovely to have you. We are very thankful that you accepted our invitation. I have some other question which I will probably email you, and
Please do.
We will have a little discussion, because you also mentioned that research paper, which I'm quite interested about. So yeah, hopefully we will stay in touch. And yeah, thanks to all of the other people.
Many thanks for the invite.
Your pleasure is on our side. Yeah, and thanks to all of you joining us throughout this term. This was the last talk of Michaelmas term, so hopefully we will see with a lot of you next term during our other talks. Have a nice rest of the day, and yeah, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.